Masechet Nazir Daf Nun Bet. We have two topics today. The first is about an ant that's missing a leg. That's ant as in A-N-T. And the second topic is going to be whether you need skull and bones to make a Nazir tameh, or skull or bones to make him tameh. Okay, so we begin. Ba'erava nimala shechasra mahu shiura gemirin la v'hachaser or biriya gemirin la v'ha'ika. This relates to what we're talking about above, where we're talking about different cases of bodies that are missing a limb. So now we're going to apply that to an ant that's missing something. So here's a general rule. In order to receive lashes for eating a prohibited food, generally, you have to have a kizayit of that food, kizayit of pig or whatever. However, this does not apply to a whole being. If you have an insect that's whole, even if it's tiny and small, you can see it, but if it's small, even if it's smaller than a kizayit, one does get lashes for it, right? So that's a special rule. That's why we are very stringent regarding looking for bugs. If there's bugs on lettuce or whatever, right? So even though it's small, one would get lashes for eating a bug if it's whole. Okay. So now, what if it's more or less whole, but a little less? It's missing a limb. So then, what do we say about that? Do we say shi'ura gemirin la? That when we say it has to be a whole bug, that means a shi'ur of a whole bug, right? We're still talking about a measurement. So there's two types of measurements. One measurement is if something is not whole, then it will be kizayit. But if it is whole, it has to be a full whole item. And if it's missing any part, then it doesn't rise up to the level of a shi'ur of a whole bug. And this is missing, so therefore one would not get lashes. Or do we say it's a creation, and as long as it's alive, if it's not missing any vital organs, and an ant can live without one leg, therefore, since it's still a whole being, it's not about it being a certain measurement and has to have all its limbs to reach that measurement, but rather just about being viable, and it is viable. And so therefore one would get lashes. All right, that's the question. Let's try to answer it. Amar Rav Yehuda midis karta tashema bahem. Yachol bechulan tamod domar mehem. I mehem yachol miksatan tamod domar bahem. Okay, we have two pisukim back to back. The pisukim are talking about a sheretz. The 8 different types of shirasim that cause special tum'ah. And so it says here, Kol hanogeya bahem bemotam hitma ad ha'arev. So anyone who touches, this is bemotam, when they are dead, will become tameh. But the next pasuk says, Kol asher yipol alav mehem. Anything on which one of them falls from one of them when they are dead. So bahem and mehem are opposite words in terms of the midrash. So on the one hand it says bahem, and so I would say maybe that seems to be an inclusive word. So can it mean that all of them, meaning only if it's complete, bahem, but the next pasuk says mehem, even a piece of it, and so that therefore we should be more machmir and say even a piece of a sheretz would cause tum'ah. We were talking about insects, but now we're just going to compare it to these eight creepy crawlies. But if it says mehem, so now any little bit? No, but that's why it says bahem, to say them, meaning the whole thing. So now we have two words that have to balance each other out. Bahem only would mean a whole. Mehem only would mean even a small part. So hakesad, how can we balance these? Ad sheyiga b'miksatan shehu kekulan v'shiaru chachamim becha adasha sheken hachomet techilat biryato becha adasha. So we can arrange for both of these words to be true. If we say it's talking about a part that is like the whole. Now, what is a part that's like the whole? The rabbi said that is a lentil, the size of a lentil. This is for shiratzim. If you have a piece of a sheretz that's the size of a lentil, that will cause sheretz tum'ah. We had the rabbis get to that because of the homet. This is one of the 8 shiratzim. People think it's a skink. Here's a picture of a skink right down here. And when it's born, its smallest size is the size of a lentil. Okay, very small. But that is when it's whole. It's not missing any parts. So what we see from here is that when we're talking about shirasim, and we want to get the smallest amount, it's not a kezayit because a whole sheretz can be less than a kezayit. So what's the smallest that a whole sheretz can be? Oh, it's a lentil size. And that lentil size means with all its limbs. So now by analogy for the ant also, when we say what's the smallest amount of a bug that one would be liable to lashes, well, that means the smallest amount with all its limbs. So it is, in fact, a shi'ur, shema'mina shi'ura gemirila. It's not just about if it's viable, if it can live or not, but rather a whole ant. And therefore, if it's missing a limb, one eats it, well, he would not get lashes. All right, that's the attempted proof, but we're going to reject it. Amar Rav Shemaya, ki ba'enan shi'ura debid la havya kadasha la mitameh, de la nafla ba neshama, aval nafla ba neshama la tiba'e lach. Rav Shemaya says, no, when we say we need a shi'ur, meaning a whole one of these skinks here, and when we say that if it's less than a lentil, then it does not cause tum'ah, that's only when it did not yet have a soul yet. By the way, you see that even shirasim have a soul. Soul means it's alive. So we're taught the rabbis use that to say, what is the minimum size of a sheretz? So they went and found a newborn skink that was not alive before, and so when it's born and it becomes alive, and it has all its limbs, and so this is the point at which it gets a soul, when it becomes alive, and it has all of them. So that's why they said the minimum size for shiratzim is lentil size. However, once something is alive already, and then it loses a limb, if it's still viable and doesn't need that limb to survive, then the rabbis may very well say that is still considered a whole. So for an ant that is missing a limb, it could very well be that that one is liable because it is viable, right? And you can't learn it from the derivation of sheretz. When they're deriving the smallest amount of sheretz, they're going to say, okay, what's the smallest possible living sheretz that just was born, assuming a whole one, right? A normal one. And so that's why they said with all its limbs. But that has nothing to do with if something is now missing a limb, but otherwise it's alive. That doesn't mean that is not called a birya, and that for the prohibition of eating insects, we would go by viability, not by its being a full size, meaning of having all its limbs. All right, so we end without any clarification on that question. The next question has to do with what the Mishnah said. Hashidra ve'hagul golet, a Nazir becomes tameh and has to shave because if he comes into contact with, and it says spine ve skull. Now the word letter vav in the Mishnah can mean and, it can also mean or. So we ask, Ibaya lehu, shidra ve'gulgolet tenan, or dilma shidra o gulgolet. So do we teach it as spine and skull? Now that is what it says, so we're taking that literally, that you need both. That would be a lenient opinion because you need both the spine and the skull to be tameh. Or should we understand it as either the spine or the skull would make a Nazir tameh? Okay, we're going to see 5 attempted proofs here, right, to say skull and or is the Machmir opinion, and so we'll see 4 proofs of that way, and 1 proof at the end that it means and. Okay, the first proof is going to be about spine without ribs is tahor, and we'll derive from that a full spine with ribs is tameh, and that would mean a spine alone. So let's see. Amar Rava, Tashema shidra shegered rov ilayin sheba tehora ubakeber afilu mishuberet or meforeket temea mipnei hakeber. The Braita teaches that if you have a spine and the ribs all fell off, so that is tahor, because that's not a full spine. It doesn't have its ribs. You need the ribs to make the spine. However, if it's all inside a grave, then even if it's broken or disassembled, that's tameh, because the grave joins everything together that's in the grave, as if it's connected. Okay, that's the end of the Braita. Tama mishum de gered halo gered tameh. In the Resha, the only reason why it's tahor is because the ribs fell off. But If the ribs did not fall off, then it would be tameh, even though it's only a spine without a skull. So this teaches that a spine alone would be tameh. Shmamina o shidra o gulgolet katane. So we learned that we should understand the vav as an or. Is that a good proof? No. Ha la katane. Ha kamashmalan dechigeret teora idach tebailach. No, it doesn't really say so. You only derived it. And so therefore, we all we know is what it says, that if the ribs fell off, it's tahor. If the ribs are on it, oh, that's a different question, right? Go ask your local rabbi about that. The Baraita is only teaching precisely what it teaches, but you can't derive from what it does not say. Okay, second attempted proof. Ta'ashema. Rabbi Yehuda omer, Shisha devarim Rabbi Akiva metameh, chamim metaharim. Vechazar bo Rabbi Akiva. This is a Tosefta in Masechet Aholot that says there are 6 scenarios in which Rabbi Akiva was machmir and said a certain arrangement of bones is tameh, and the Chamim were lenient and they said it's tahor. But Rabbi Akiva changed his mind. Uma'aseh she'aviu kupa mele'a asamot bet ha'knesset shel tarsiyim v'nichuha ba'avir v'nichnas todos harofeh v'chol harofim imo v'amru en kan shidra mimet ehad. And there was an actual case from the synagogue of the blacksmiths, and they brought a basket full of bones into the Bet Knesset, and they hung it in the airspace. The reason they hung it as an airspace in the courtyard and not under the roof is because if it was enough bones from a corpse, then it would cause tent impurity, and so that would be bad. And so they put it not touching anything, hanging, and in the airspace, not under the roof, so that they can come and test it out. And so they asked Todos, the doctor. He's an expert. He examined all the bones, and the other doctors also were with him. They examined the bones together, and they concluded that there is not a full spine from one corpse. Right? There are pieces of spines from one corpse and pieces from another. But it sounds like the minimum you would need is a spine from one corpse. That's the end of the story. Ta'ama deleka shidra demehada ha'ika o shidra o gulgolet demehada Nazir megaleach aleha shema'mina o shidra o gulgolet tenan. So from the story we can derive that the reason why they decided it was tahor. By the way, the end of the story is that since there's no spine from one, so then the rabbi said it should be okay. And then Rabbi Akiva is there. Rabbi Akiva says even if it's from 2 different corpses, it would still be tameh. So they asked him, Rabbi Akiva, let's vote. What do you say? And Rabbi Akiva said, I think it's tahor. From the fact that he voted tahor means he changed his mind, because originally he said even if you can combine it from 2 corpses, it's tameh. Okay, well, so that's the end of the story. So anyway, the reason that the sages said that it's okay is because there is no full spine from one body. That we can infer from that were there a full spine from one body or a skull from one body, then it would be tameh lamet, tameh ohel, and the Nazir would have to shave for that. And so we can learn from there that it means or, either a skull or a spine. All right, this looks like a good proof, but we're going to reject it. Lami baya kama. Lami baya shidra v'golgolet mimet ehad leka, ela afilu o shidra mimet ehad o golgolet mimet ehad leka. The doctors were not being so precise with their language, and so they were saying obviously this and certainly that. So they were saying alomi baya, not necessary to say. I don't even have to tell you that we do not have a skull and a spine and a skull all from one body. And that's what you would need, right? It could be that you need both. And so and the doctors come and say, listen, I'm not even going to mention that you don't have a full spine and skull from one body. Rather, I'll tell you even bigger that you do not have even just a skull from one body, or just a spine, not even just a spine from one body, nor just a skull from one body. So if you don't even have just a spine from one body, certainly you don't have a spine and a skull. But it could very well be that in order for it to be tameh, you would need both a spine and a skull. All right, so we do not have any proof from this source. Let's go back to the outline to see where we were. We just finished the second proof that tried to say, since the doctor said there isn't a spine from two, and that's why it's tahor, maybe we can infer that if it was a full spine from one, that would be tameh, and a spine by itself. And then we said, no, the doctors were not speaking so precisely. They were saying, obviously, there's not a skull and spine together that you might need, but there's not even just a spine from one. Okay, so that is left inconclusive. Now we're going to read the rest of that baraita that actually lists all 6 of the issues that were under dispute between Rabbi Akiva and the sages. Now, in order to get to 6, we're going to have to read spine and skull together as one, because otherwise it's going to be too many. It's going to be 7. And so this will be an attempted proof that you need spine and skull. I know I had this pink before, but I just changed it to green, because this is actually a proof for the and side. And so let's see the continuation. Tashema miminyana. Let's learn from the count. Umahen shisha devarim shel Rabbi Akiva metameh v'chamim metaharin. What are the 6 issues that Rabbi Akiva was stringent and said tameh, and Chamim said tahor? Al ever min hamet sheba mishene metim. If you have a limb, let's say an arm from a dead body, but an arm by itself from one body, certainly everyone agrees would be tameh. But what if the arm comes from 2 bodies? You have half an arm of one body and half an arm from another person. Together, they make do they cause tum'ah or not? Tumat ohel, and the answer is Rabbi Akiva's machmir. Rabbanan disagree, and they say no, it has to be from one body. That's one. Alever min hachai sheba mishene bnei adam, and the same thing is an amputated limb from a person who is alive. Also causes tum'ah. If it was from one person, for sure, surely it would cause tum'ah. But if it's half from one person and half from another a person, they're both alive, amputated, half of an amputated arm, then Rabbi Akiva is machmir on that. Third issue, al chatzi kav atzamot sheba mishene metim. Everyone agrees that if you have a kav, a half kav of atzamot, of bones, that causes tum'ah. But what if it from one person? What if it comes from two different people? Rabbi Akiva is machmir. Sages are mekel. Ve'al revi'it dam haba mishanayim, or revi'it dam, again from one person. Everyone would agree that would be tameh. But revi'it dam from 2 people, Rabbi Akiva's original position was tameh. This one we're going to see he may not have even changed his mind about that. Now the smallest amount of a body that can cause tum'ah, although not tent impurity, just regular impurity for touching it, is a barley grain size bone. And now if it's from one person, or a whole one, then yes. But if it's split into 2, and now it's just two halves of it, Rabbi Akiva was machmir, and the Chachamim are mekel and say it's tahor. So that's already 6. That's already 5 items, and now you have v'hashidra v'hagulgolet. If that's 5, and then shidra would be 6, gulgolet would be 7. If you count shidra and gulgolet as separate things, then you have 7 items. So therefore, you have to read it as shidra ve'gulgolet means 1. That's together number 6. If you think it's or, then you're going to end up 7. So that is the proof, and now we're going to reject it. Then we're going to reject it in a few different ways, because in other words, the point is that you can count shidra and gulgolet as 2 separate ones, as an or, and we have other ways of counting the first ones, so that we can combine or not count one of them, so that we will still end up with 6, and there'll only be 5 others besides the shidra and gulgolet. So there's a few ways to count the others as 5. Here's a few of them. And there's a mnemonic here to remember these different answers. When we were counting the 6, we were only counting cases where there is a majority against Rabbi Akiva. But we're not counting the smallest size bone that it's like a barley grain, because there it's not the majority against Rabbi Akiva, but rather only a single opinion against Rabbi Akiva. And we know this from a Braita, Detanya Esim Kesora Shenechlak L'Shnayim. Rabbi Akiva metameh, Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri metaher. If you have a barley grain that divided into 2, and each one is smaller than a barley grain, Rabbi Akiva says it's still tameh, and Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri says it's tahor. But but only one sage disagrees with Rabbi Akiva. So therefore, this is not counted among the 6, right? If you remember here, it says that chachamim metaharin. We're only going to count 6 cases where the majority of sages disagree. We happen to put this into the list because it is another case where Rabbi Akiva is machmir compared to someone, but it's not counted in the enumeration of 6. So if you take this one out, then you're left with only 4 other cases plus shidra plus gulgolet. That makes 6. So there's no proof that it's an and. It could very well be an or. All right, that's one way of recounting. A second way, or maybe we should count the ever min hamet, but not the ever min hachai over here. So perhaps they disagree only regarding a limb from a dead body from 2 people, but the one from a live body, either don't count it at all or count these 2 together as one, right? Ever min hamet, ever min hachai, the same case. And so we would not count that as 2, and that allows for shidra and gulgolet being counted separately. A third way of answering the recounting, or maybe we're only counting things that would cause tent impurity and are therefore also severe enough that they would make a Nazir have to shave. But the the barley grain size does not cause tent impurity. And so that's why it's not as stringent as the other ones. And it only causes tumat met from contact and carrying, not tent impurity. So we're listing 6 items that include tent impurity, and the Nazir would have to shave if he was in that tent. So that's another way of counting. And the fourth way of recounting, we're only counting cases when Rabbi Akiva changed his mind to agree with the majority. But regarding the Revi'it Dam that comes from 2 bodies, there, Rabbi Akiva never changed his mind. And we know this from a conversation that Rabbi Yudanas, he said to Bar Kapara, said, do not include Revi'it Dam in the list of things that Rabbi Akiva changed his mind, right? Don't list it. Because Rabbi Akiva, for that, has a good source. And furthermore, a pasuk supports him, right? So he had limudo beyado. He had a tradition about this, and he had a pasuk that supports him. The pasuk is Val kol nafshot met lo yavo, regarding a kohen gadol. It says nafshot met. And we said nefesh is referring to blood, right? Ki adam hu hanafesh, and that's in plural. So that refers to 2 sources of blood from dead people will combine. And so since he has a source, he refused to give in and change his mind about that. Rabbi Shimon Omer, ad yamav haya metameh, im mishemet chazar bo, eni yodeya. Rabbi Shimon also supports the fact that Rabbi Akiva never changed his mind, and he said it in a rhetorical way against the other opinion, maybe the Tanah that did list it in the list. So Rabbi Shimon says, you put that on the list of things that Rabbi Akiva changed his mind? No, I know for sure. This is Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, Rabbi Akiva's student. And he says, all of Rabbi Akiva's days, he always said that blood from 2 corpses is tameh. If he changed his mind after he died, I don't know about that. right? He's being sarcastic, right? Of course, he didn't change his mind after he died. So that's at the extent to which Rabbi Shimon was antagonistic about that opinion. So Rabbi Shimon confirms, in fact, Rabbi Akiva never changed his mind about that. Now, incidentally, Tana hushcharush ta'aniyotav. After Rabbi Shimon said that, he used this kind of sarcastic language that was not respectful to Rabbi Akiva, right? To say, oh, maybe he changed his mind after he died. It wasn't a nice way to speak, and so he fasted. Because he spoke in a disrespectful way, he fasted so many times that his teeth became blackened. All right, what we see from here is that Rabbi Akiva did not change his mind about dam, and that's why we should not count it in this list. And so if you take that out, then you have room to count skull or bones as two separate ones, and therefore there is no proof from here. All right, that completes proof number 3. Okay, and now we're going to continue and learn something from what Shammai says. Shammai Hazaken. Okay, Tashema. This is a Mishnah in Eduyot that teaches the Tanya. Bet Shammai Omerim. Rov Atzamot min Atzamim, or Mishenayim, or Mishelosha. Bet Shammai says, in order to have impurity, this corpse impurity for a tent, you need Rova, a quarter kav of Atzamot, from among other bones. Or and so, in other words, it can't just be one. It's got to be at least 2 or 3. Okay, and so it can't just have one. That's Bet Shammai. Bet Hillel omrim rova min hageviyah merov habinyan or merov haminyan. And Bet Shammai seems to disagree and say, and he says rova min hageviyah, quarter kav of bones from one body, from the same body. And it can be either from the majority of its structure or the majority of the number. So that if it's either one, so you could have a majority of the number if you have many small bones, even if it's not a majority of the size of the person, or you could have a majority of the size just from 3 bones, if you take very long bones. And so either one. Okay, so that's the machloket. Now, Amar Rabbi Yoshua, this is all still in the Mishnah, commenting on this machloket. Bet Shammai and Bet Hillel says, Yachoni lasot divrei Bet Shammai v'divrei Bet Hillel ke'echad. They're not necessarily disagreeing. They might just be using different language to say the same thing, right? They're emphasizing different cases, but actually we can reconcile their opinions. How could we do that? Shebet Shammai omrim mishenayim o mishelosha o mishenei shokayim v'yarech echad o mishenei yerechayim v'shok echad hoil v'rov govo shel adam migova. Bet Shammai is giving an illustration of where you would have rov binyan, the majority of the structure of the height of a person. So Bet Shammai is giving an example. If you have a majority, it doesn't mean majority as in number, but majority as in the size of the bones, and it couldn't be from just 2 or 3, you can get a majority of a person's height. How could you do that? Either from 2 shin bones and 1 thigh bone, or 2 thigh bones and 1 shin bone. Or in other words, 2 femurs and a tibia, or 2 tibias and a femur. The femur is the longest bone in the body, and you take 2 or 3 of those, and you already get the majority of a person's height. So that's what Bet Shammai was giving an example of that. And then, Bet Hillel omrim min hageviyah o merov binyan o merov minyan ho'il v'yeshnan b'mifrekei yadayim v'raglayim. And so then Bet Hillel says, majority of bones from the body, and it can be the majority of the height of the body, as my colleagues at Bet Shammai said, or it can also be the majority of the number, because if you look in the hand and the feet, there are a lot of very small bones, and you could take the majority of them, you get 120 something of them, and then that would be majority, even though if you just put them all back to back, there'd actually be only a small amount, but that also. And so maybe Bet Shammai and Bet Hillel agree, they're just presenting one case or the other case. All right, so that's the interpretation. Now we get to the part that we've been waiting for. Shammai omed afilu aisem min hashidra o min hagulgolet. This is Shammai himself. This is Shammai Hazaken, who had a much more stringent opinion than Bet Shammai. It's interesting that there could be a difference between Shammai and Bet Shammai. Right? Over time, I guess Bet Shammai adjusted themselves to be more lenient. But Shammai himself said, even if there's just one bone from the skull or one bone from the spine, that is enough to cause tent impurity. So what's the point? If Shammai himself said one bone from this or one bone from that, but they did say or. So let's presume that the sages who disagreed with Shammai, everybody else, would agree with that. With the or part of it, they just think that it's not enough to have one bone. You need an entire spine or an entire skull. But if you have an entire spine or an entire skull, either one or the other, then that would cause tent impurity. So that would be the derivation that the machloket would be parallel, right? Would be somewhat similar. So we reject this proof and we say, no, Shammai de Mahmir. No, Shammai was so Mahmir, he was so extreme all the way on one side to say even one bone just from the spine or one bone just from the skull, that would be sufficient to make it tameh. But the sages might be on the other extreme and say, no, you need a full spine and a full skull. And it's and. So therefore you cannot prove from Shammai because Shammai was an extreme opinion. Now we're going to, based on that assumption, prove from the opposite. If in fact they were Shammai was so extreme that he was all the way on one side, and we can assume that the rabbis were all the way on the other side, well, that itself can be a proof the other way. Livshot mina tama de bet Shammai de machmir hadabanan adi gashidra vegulgolet. We can assume that the reason why Bet Shammai says just one bone from either or the spine or the skull is because they are so machmir, and so if they're so machmir, then must be that the rabbis are all the way on the other side, and they would say there has to be a full spine and a full skull. And so from here we can prove that it's and. Let's just go back to our outline one more time. Right, proof 4 was since Shammai says either or, the rabbis maybe also say either or. The difference is only that Shammai says one bone from either or, and the rabbis say you need a full from either or. But this is not necessarily. Shammai is such an extremist, right? Okay, fine. So if Shammai is such an extremist, and the middle opinion would be and, fine, so let's prove from that. Shammai says or because they're so extreme. The rabbis are the opposite, so they say a full skull and a spine. That's the final attempted proof for leniency, but we reject that as well. Lo ad kan lo peligi rabbanan ale de Shammai ele be'aisem echad de'atem min hashidra u'min hagilgolet gulgolet aval hecha de'ite be'ayneh afilu chada minehon. Not necessarily. It could be that the controversy is not that extreme, and the rabbis only disagree against Shammai when there's just one bone from either the spine or one from the skull, and that's not enough just to have one. But if you have an entirety either from the skull or an entire spine, then that alone would be sufficient. And so we can't tell either way from here, and so we leave this question open whether in the Mishnah when it says spine and skull, did that mean both in order to make a Nazir tameh, or just either one or the other causes tent impurity. Baruch Adonai Le'olam, amen v'amen.